Have you ever walked away from a conversation and thought, why did I let them talk to me like that? Maybe it was just a comment, a glance, a joke dressed as a jab, and yet it stuck. You tried to stay calm. Maybe you even laughed it off, but inside something didn't sit right. Not because you were weak, but because somewhere deep down, a part of you knew, this isn't how I want to be treated, and I don't know how to. Stop it, without becoming someone I'm not. If that sounds familiar, this video is for you. Because true power isn't about shutting people down. It's about standing so deeply rooted in yourself that no one can shake you out of it. And that kind of power begins in silence. Not passive silence, but sacred silence. The kind that listens inward before it speaks outward. The kind that teaches others, without raising your voice, how to meet you with respect. In the next few minutes, we'll walk through 6 mindful ways to hold your dignity when the world forgets to. You won't need to argue. You won't need to harden. You'll just need to remember, you've always had the power to choose how you show up and how you let others stay. The gaze that awakens, a Zen approach to the silent stare. There is a certain kind of gaze that doesn't seek to dominate, doesn't demand submission, and doesn't even ask for understanding. It simply sees. It sees clearly, calmly, without judgment, and without moving. In Zen, this is not just a technique. It is a state of being, a living stillness that watches without getting pulled in, a silent refusal to abandon your center, even as the world tries to provoke a reaction from you. When someone speaks to you with disrespect, whether it's a condescending tone, a mocking laugh, or a careless interruption, there's often a moment of friction inside. The urge to respond, to defend, to level the playing field. But in that instant, you have a choice. You can become reactive, or you can become aware. And awareness, pure, grounded awareness, is far more powerful than any clever response could ever be. The gaze that awakens isn't meant to unsettle. It's not a weapon. It's a mirror. When you hold that kind of presence, without flinching or performing, it reflects back something people don't always expect to see: themselves, their behavior, their energy. And in the absence of your reaction, they're left with only that reflection. And often, that's more than enough to shift the dynamic. I've seen this work in moments that didn't require words. A long meeting where someone kept interrupting. A family dinner where sarcasm cut deeper than it should. I didn't speak up, not because I was afraid, but because I chose not to be pulled out of myself. I looked at them, not with anger, not with judgment, but with stillness. Just stillness. And slowly, the current shifted. They quieted. Others noticed. Not because I fought back, but because I stayed rooted. In Zen practice, we return again and again to the breath, to posture, to stillness. Not because life is always calm, but because we can be. The gaze is a posture of the mind, upright, alert, and unmoved. It doesn't mean we are numb. It means we are deeply alive and choosing presence over performance. Neuroscience tells us that eye contact activates emotional regulation in both the observer and the observed. But spiritual traditions go further. They remind us that how we see is also how we live. When your gaze is calm, your energy says, I will not be drawn into chaos. It teaches others, wordlessly, what kind of space you hold and what kind of presence you expect. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to prove your strength. You just need to remain soft, aware, unmoved. That stillness will say more than any defense ever could. Because the awakened gaze is not just about seeing them. It's about seeing yourself clearly enough to know that you don't need to react to be whole. When silence speaks louder, the sacred power of non-reaction. There's a certain kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of presence, full of choice, full of self-respect. It's not the silence of retreat or avoidance. It's the silence that says, I see what's happening, and I'm choosing peace over participation. In a world that teaches us to clap back, speak louder, and never let anything slide, this kind of silence feels radical, but maybe that's exactly why. It's so powerful. We've all been in those moments. Someone throws a passive-aggressive jab, a backhanded compliment, or a loud, unnecessary critique. The air gets tense. Your chest tightens. The impulse to defend yourself rises like a wave. You want to prove you're not weak. You want to explain why they're wrong. But what if you didn't? What if, instead, you just paused? When you stop feeding energy to disrespect, you begin to reclaim your power. Not by overpowering the other person, but by not giving them control over your emotional state. In that silence, you're not giving up. You're anchoring down. You're choosing to respond, not with words, but with awareness. The Buddha once taught that holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You're the one who gets burned. Silence, when chosen with mindfulness, becomes the refusal to pick up that coal. It doesn't mean the fire isn't there. It means you won't let it burn you from the inside. I remember sitting across from someone who was clearly trying to provoke me. The tone, the smug expression, the words all carefully crafted to make me react. In the past, I would have taken the bait, defended myself, corrected them, tried to be the bigger person, while still needing them to know I was right. But that day, I simply breathed. I looked at them, and I said nothing. The silence between us stretched like a quiet sky. At first, they kept talking, trying harder. Then something shifted. The energy drained out of their words. My lack of reaction became a mirror they weren't prepared to look into. And that was enough. Modern psychology confirms this, too. When you don't react, you interrupt the loop that perpetuates toxic dynamics. You remove the fuel. And when there's no fuel, the fire dies out on its own. Silence isn't passive, it's active. Containment. It's the still hand that prevents the cup from spilling. But this kind of silence isn't easy. It requires inner steadiness. It means facing your own discomfort without rushing to escape it through words. It's the kind of silence that holds space, not just for your own dignity, but even for the possibility that the other person might eventually see themselves more clearly. In Taoist thought, water is the softest thing in the world, but it can overcome the hardest stone. Why? Because it doesn't resist. It doesn't fight. It simply stays in its nature. That's the spirit of mindful silence. You don't have to harden to protect yourself. You can remain soft, remain still, and still remain unshaken. When someone disrespects you, you don't owe them your reaction. You owe yourself your peace. And sometimes, silence is not the absence of strength. It's the highest expression of it. Because it means you're no longer trying to win someone's approval. You're not performing worthiness. You're simply inhabiting it. So next time someone tests your boundaries with words designed to cut or provoke, try this. Pause. Let their words float in the space between you. Don't catch them. Don't chase them. Just let them fall. Let silence speak on your behalf. Not out of pride, but out of clarity. Not out of fear, but out of freedom. Because when you no longer need to explain, defend, or react, you are no longer seeking power. You are power made quiet. And that is the kind of strength the world doesn't expect, but so desperately needs. No need to justify. Letting go of the habit to explain yourself. There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that comes not from what we do, but from constantly feeling like we have to explain why we do it, why we said no, why we changed careers, why we didn't show up, why we need space, why we chose differently. It's a weight that accumulates slowly, silently, until one day, we realize we've spent more energy justifying our existence than actually living it. We're taught early that we owe people explanations. That politeness means giving reasons. That not explaining makes us seem rude, arrogant, even selfish. But here's the truth. Over-explaining is often not about kindness. It's about fear. fear of being misunderstood, fear of being judged, fear of not being liked. And so we over-explain to feel safe, to soften our truth, to make ourselves more palatable. But there is freedom in no longer needing to be understood. Not because you don't care, but because you've stopped outsourcing your self-worth. You've stopped treating someone else's approval as a condition for your peace. I remember a time I decided to step back from a long-standing commitment that was draining me. The moment I announced it, the question started, why now? Are you sure? Can't you push through a little longer? I found myself crafting careful explanations, trying to make them feel better about my choice. Until I realized I didn't need to. My peace didn't require their permission. There's a line from the Talmud that says, say little, do much. And from the Tao, the sage does not speak, and yet is understood. These teachings point to the same idea, that your truth doesn't need a press release. It just needs to be lived. The habit of explaining ourselves is deeply rooted. It often comes from childhood, where approval meant survival. But as adults, continuing to seek that validation keeps us small. It turns every decision into a negotiation, every boundary into a debate, and that robs us of our center. Letting go of the need to justify is not about shutting people out. It's about standing in quiet alignment with who you are. When you say, no, thank you, or this isn't for me, and leave it at that, you're declaring trust in yourself. You're saying, I know what's right for me, even if you don't. Of course, there will be moments when context matters, when explanation can be an act of connection. But when the explanation becomes a way to earn validation, it stops being connection. It becomes performance. And that's when you lose yourself. In mindfulness practice, we're taught to come back to the breath, not because the breath is interesting, but because it's ours. It's always there, always true. In the same way, when you return to your inner knowing, to your sense of what feels aligned, you don't need to dress it up with justification. It is enough because it comes from you. So the next time you feel the urge to explain yourself, pause. Ask yourself, am I doing this from love or from fear? If it's from love, go ahead. Share. But if it's from fear, let silence be your boundary. Let trust be your reply. Because your life is not a courtroom. Your decisions are not on trial. And you, my friend, are not here to be endlessly explained. You are here to be lived. Space as compassion, the art of loving from a distance. There comes a time in almost every relationship, whether with a friend, a parent, a partner, when love alone isn't enough to keep you close. Not because you've stopped caring, but because staying close starts to hurt. The words sting more. The silences grow heavier. The energy drains faster than you can recover. And deep down, something inside you whispers, you need space. Not to punish, not to escape, but to breathe. In our culture, distance is often seen as failure, as betrayal, as coldness. We've been conditioned to think that love means constant closeness, unwavering presence, complete availability. But the truth is, love without boundaries isn't intimacy, it's enmeshment. And when your peace is constantly disturbed by someone's disrespect, inconsistency, or emotional chaos, choosing space isn't a sign of disconnection, it's a sign of wisdom. There's a kind of love that doesn't hover or fix or sacrifice endlessly. It simply steps back, quietly, respectfully. It says, I love you, and I'm going to love you from over here, because I need to love myself too. That kind of love is harder, less romantic, less visible, but infinitely more sustainable. In Buddhist practice, compassion isn't about martyrdom. It's not about giving yourself away until there's nothing left. It's about holding both truths at once, your care for the other and your care for yourself. And sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do, for both of you, is to create space. I once had a friend I deeply cared about, but every interaction left me feeling smaller. There were subtle put-downs, constant competition, jokes that didn't land kindly. I kept making excuses. Maybe they're just having a hard time. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. But over time, I realized I was shrinking around them. And no love, no loyalty is worth losing yourself. So I took a step back, not with a dramatic goodbye, not with blame, just a soft boundary quietly placed. Less time, less access, more breath. At first, the guilt was loud, but then came the clarity, the peace. And in that space, I began to grow again. I remembered who I was when I wasn't bending. Psychologists call this differentiation, the ability to stay connected to someone while staying grounded in yourself. It's the space where true love lives, not in control or rescue, but in mutual respect. Sometimes, people won't understand why you pulled back. That's okay. Let them misunderstand. The space you create isn't for them to feel comfortable. It's for you to heal, to reflect, to return to yourself. Even in the teachings of Jesus, we find him often retreating into solitude, not because he didn't care, but because he understood that love needs replenishment. The desert was not rejection, it was restoration. In Taoism, it is said, clay is shaped into a pot, but it's the emptiness inside that holds what we value. Space is not absence. It is sacred form. So if there is someone in your life whose presence feels heavy, confusing, or diminishing, know this. You don't have to choose between loving them and loving yourself. You can do both. You can care from a distance. You can forgive without re-entering the pattern. You can release without resentment. Space, when chosen with love, is not abandonment. It is clarity. It's saying, I see you. I just can't carry both of us right now. And that's not selfish. That's sacred. The deepest relationships are not the ones with no space, but the ones where space is allowed and love still breathes in the quiet. The posture of inner nobility, holding your head high with grace. There's something unmistakably powerful about someone who walks into a room with quiet confidence. Not the kind that needs to be seen, not the kind that dominates conversation or demands attention, but the kind that lives in posture, in presence, in the simple way they carry themselves. Shoulders relaxed, chin slightly lifted, eyes soft but steady. A quiet declaration, I know who I am. To hold your head high, especially in the face of disrespect or doubt, is not arrogance. It's not ego. It's a return to dignity. It's remembering that your worth doesn't come from how others see you, but from how deeply you choose to see yourself. We live in a world that's constantly trying to make us shrink. Criticism disguised as concern. Microaggressions passed off as jokes. Opinions offered when none were asked for. And over time, we start to internalize the message. Be smaller. Be quieter. Be less. But dignity says, be still. Be whole. Be exactly as you are. There's a phrase in Zen. Sit like a mountain. Let the winds come and go. It doesn't just apply to meditation cushions. It applies to meetings, to family dinners, to subway rides and waiting rooms and heated conversations. It means you don't collapse under pressure. You don't let other people's chaos decide your center. You remember that nobility isn't a birthright. It's a choice you make every time you rise, internally, when the world tries to pull you down. I've seen people respond to insults not with fire, but with stillness. Not with a clap back, but with grace. And in that grace, there's more power than any comeback could ever hold. Because it's not reactive. It's rooted. It doesn't shout, I matter. It simply lives as though that truth is already known. When you walk with your head high, not to tower over others, but to honor yourself, you're sending a message without speaking. I will not be diminished just because someone else refuses to see clearly. And that message doesn't just impact others. It transforms you. It lifts you from within. It recalibrates your nervous system. It teaches your own mind that you are safe to take up space. Modern psychology backs this up. Body posture influences mindset. When we carry ourselves with openness and length, we breathe more fully, think more clearly, and feel more empowered. This isn't about pretending to be confident. It's about aligning your body with a truth your soul already knows. There's a story from African tradition that says, when lions forget they are lions, they listen to hyenas. Too often, we let smallness shape our sense of self, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. But dignity is your birthright. And every time you hold your head high, even when it's hard, you're remembering what you've always known deep down. You are not here to shrink. You are here to stand in the fullness of who you are. You don't have to argue with those who doubt you. You don't have to collapse in the presence of their dismissal. You just have to remain upright, present, at peace. So the next time someone tries to dim your light with criticism or condescension, resist the urge to explain, defend, or retaliate. Instead, soften your shoulders. Take a breath and lift your gaze, not in defiance, but in remembrance. Remembrance of your worth. Remembrance of your wholeness. Remembrance of your place in the world. Because holding your head high isn't about pride. It's about presence. And presence is the quiet posture of inner nobility. The standard you set. Becoming the teacher of how others treat you. Whether we realize it or not, we are always teaching people how to treat us, not through lectures or confrontations, but through what we tolerate, through how we respond when someone crosses a line, through what we stay silent about, and what we walk away from. Every moment becomes a lesson, not just for them, but for us. It's easy to blame others when we feel disrespected. And yes, people should know better. But the deeper truth is that most people treat you the way you've shown them is acceptable. Not because they're cruel, but because you've unknowingly taught them what your boundaries are by how consistently you uphold them or don't. The standard you set isn't about being perfect or unbending. It's about clarity. It's about deciding, with love and conviction, what you will and will not allow in your life. Not as punishment, but as protection. Not as control, but as care. When you set a standard rooted in self-respect, you don't have to demand respect from others. It naturally calibrates how they interact with you. I remember a time when I kept allowing small things to slide. A dismissive comment here, a joke at my expense there. I didn't want to seem too sensitive. I didn't want to make it awkward. But each time I stayed quiet, I taught them it was okay. And each time, I betrayed a part of myself that was asking to be seen. Eventually, I realized something essential. Boundaries aren't walls, they're invitations. They say, this is how I move through the world. If you want to walk beside me, here's how. And if someone can't, or won't, meet you there, that's their choice. But you still get to choose what energy you allow in your life. In Buddhism, there's a principle of right relationship, not just with others, but with yourself. To be in right relationship with yourself means honoring your needs, protecting your energy, and refusing to abandon yourself for the comfort of others. It means being your own guardian, not out of fear, but out of love. When you embody that standard, you stop needing to convince anyone of your worth. You stop negotiating for the bare minimum. You start attracting people who recognize your value because they feel the strength of someone who's already claimed it. You become the teacher, not with your words, but with your walk, with your calm no, with your graceful silence, with your willingness to leave when staying means shrinking. And here's the beauty of it. The more you align with your own standard, the less effort you need to enforce it. Your presence does the work. Your energy sets the tone. You no longer need to fight for respect. You become the space where respect naturally arises. So if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, unvalued, ask yourself gently, what have I been teaching the world about how to treat me? And then, without shame, begin to revise the lesson. Begin to stand, speak, pause, and walk in a way that honors who you truly are. You're not here to be everything for everyone. You're here to be whole. And when you live from that wholeness, you teach others not just how to treat you, but how to treat themselves. Because the standard you set doesn't just protect your peace. It becomes a mirror that invites others to rise too. Self-respect is the practice of the awakened. By now, you may realize this wasn't really about how to handle disrespect, not in the way the world usually teaches us. It wasn't about being tougher, louder, sharper. It wasn't about winning against anyone. It was about remembering something much quieter and much more powerful, that every moment of disregard, every careless comment, every invisible cut is an invitation, not to react, but to return to yourself. Self-respect isn't a performance. It's not a slogan. It's a practice, a presence, a homecoming. It's choosing over and over to stay close to your own dignity, even when others walk far from theirs. It's choosing silence over noise, stillness over struggle, grace over ego, not because you're trying to be better than anyone, but because you've realized that your peace is too sacred to trade for temporary validation. Maybe, for most of your life, no one showed you how to do this. Maybe you learned that strength meant defending yourself loudly, or explaining yourself endlessly, or forgiving people who hadn't yet learned how to value you. Maybe your boundaries were shaped by fear, or guilt, or the belief that your worth was something fragile. But what if it's not? What if it's been steady all along, just waiting for you to stand with it? Every pause you take before reacting, every breath you choose instead of a fight, every time you walk away with softness instead of burning with resentment, that's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's presence. That's what awakening looks like in everyday life. Not in temples or retreats, but in difficult conversations, uncomfortable silences, and ordinary choices made with extraordinary clarity. Because when you respect yourself, deeply and without condition, you don't have to teach anyone a lesson. Your life becomes the lesson. Your calm becomes the boundary. Your quiet becomes the mirror. Your energy, rooted, clear, unshaken, teaches others not just how to treat you, but how to return to something real in themselves. If any part of this journey helped you breathe deeper, soften into clarity, or remember something you've always known, then you're already practicing. You're already awakening. And if this message found you at the right moment, stay a little longer. Sit with it. And when you're ready, walk with us into the next reflection. You're welcome to subscribe, not for noise, but for stillness. Share this with someone who's quietly carrying what you've carried. And if your path leads you here again, we'll be waiting, just as steady, just as silent, just as awake. Because self-respect isn't an act of rebellion. It's an act of remembrance. And now, you remember.